I want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. We have a wonderful guest here. His name's Brian Mckee. He's going to be facilitating our conversation today. So we got some people in person here at the Finks patio, and we got you online. We're also going to record this as well, so that way the people that are currently working or maybe have some other obligations can go back and rewatch. So we'll make sure that we get this out to everyone. So without further ado, here is I'd like to introduce Brian.
Thanks so much, Jack, and I'll do a scan of the room, patio, as well as the Zoom environment here. Thanks again for the invite, and just I guess a little bit about myself. So I have been in the space of cross-cultural slash intercultural competency and development for at least the last 10 years. I'm also what you would call a social entrepreneur, and that's an individual that looks at the different inequities in society and comes up with creative solutions to help solve those problems. Additionally, I am a multi-ethnic church pastor, which also looks like doing life with people from various backgrounds, getting to know one another, making mistakes, getting back up, and trying again. So that's a little bit about my background and even experience in this space. In initial conversations, we talked about with the climate that we're in right now as it relates to the racial climate, as it relates to being in the middle of a pandemic now, and just all of the stresses and pressures that all of us are facing right now. What would be a good forum to open up and really just share and ask questions, right? So we developed this time for you all to be able to open up and ask questions. I know much of the content would focus on today would focus on from racial tensions, also talking about like protests, even questions around like how did we get here, right, as a country, and why are we seeing some of the things that are taking place in our nation right now and even locally. So with the experience that I have, as well as research and just a lot of personal experience as well, guess you guys thought it was okay for me to be before you today and kind of field some questions, right? So with that, just want to give just a cursory or a kind of a high level overview of maybe some of the things that we are facing right now, and then open up for questions. Because again, this is interactive. I want to be able to hear what all of you all are thinking, what's on your hearts and your minds, because I know again that this is a stressful time, and I want to be a help, right? I want to be a support and helping you work through these things, right? So we know that just a month ago, there was a situation that happened in Minneapolis. A guy by the name of George Floyd was killed by a police officer who was kneeling on his neck for about 8 minutes and 46 seconds, right? And that was something that different than many of the other kind of racially fueled or police brutality situations, a little bit different than previous ones, is we were able to see this entire situation kind of unfold, right? And in seeing this entire situation unfold, what it did was it impacted all of us that watched it or that could stand to watch it in a very traumatic way. With that taking place, there was then that immediate kind of reaction of the city saying, okay, this has gone on for too long. We can't stand this anymore. Something has to be done. And after that point, then we find that there were protests, in some cases riots, and as well as city and other officials saying, what can we do to switch up and to change some things, right? Because this is very important for us to handle and address this situation. But it not only happened in Minneapolis, but we see that it happened all across the country. As a matter of fact, there was certain points where in all 50 states there were protests that were happening, that were sparked by George Floyd's murder. We see even internationally, we see these kinds of things are taking place as well too. So with that, I kind of wanted to just ground us in that, right? And then now ask questions. I know some questions might come from a historical perspective, right? So I came ready to address many of those questions as well too. So I want to open up the floor and just kind of hear from you all. What are some questions that you have as it relates to the protests, riots, Black Lives Matter, like all of these different kinds of topics that are swirling right now? I have lived in Milwaukee most of my life. Yes. Yep. Moved here when I was 6.
Okay. So I moved here in '88,
Mhm.
and I worked with many races at a restaurant downtown. I think
Mhm.
this is like the '80s when the Bucks were still at the Mecca.
Oh wow. Yeah.
It was so fun. But I mean, I remember having coworkers that even in '88,
Mhm.
black male coworkers that would walk home and get stopped by the police weekly.
Yeah.
And that was a long time ago, and it seems like what has been different here. But also in Milwaukee, as a white person, I don't want to be the person to say that I'm proud of what's happened here, but because I think this city has been listed as one of the most segregated in the country, and it seems like the leaders here of the protests have been like real leaders doing peaceful things. I mean, there's a lot more violent in other cities, and given Milwaukee's history of that segregation, I was like, where's this gonna go? And I feel like do you attribute that to the leaders? I know I watched your Frank Mitty interview.
Yes.
How do you think things have been peaceful, organized here in Milwaukee?
Yeah, and so and thank you for taking the time to check that out as well too. So the question again for those that are on Zoom as well, how do I feel that things as it relates to organizing of protests is going in Milwaukee? And it's definitely going well in that you have leaders that this isn't their first rodeo, right? So from Frank to Khalil Coleman is another one, to Vaughn Mays, to Tory Lowe, just a whole host of community activists. They have at least a decade plus a piece that have had experience in not only leading protests, but fighting for change. And so with our city, that's one of the benefits that we have, that it's not just one individual, but it's multiple, and they're actually forming alliances to say, okay, here are the specific demands that we have, and these are things that we want to see changed in our area. The other thing that makes, I think, Milwaukee a good place as it relates to the organization of the community activists is that there are also local officials that they are aligning themselves with. So like the specific demands that they have aren't just coming out of thin air, right? There are community officials that have already said, from mayor and fire and police commissioners, that have said the Milwaukee Police Department's use of force policy, and that's basically like the standard operating procedure for your police department, that it has some gaps. It has some real gaps. Some of those gaps would be that strangleholds are allowed. You're still able to shoot at a moving vehicle, even if there's no imminent harm or danger to yourself, right? You're still able, as a police officer, you don't necessarily have to report, another officer, or stand in the way if something is happening that's of excessive force, right? So all of these are gaps, but you're seeing local leaders and local activists standing together and aligning with this and saying, okay, here are our demands. These things need to change. And we are seeing some real movement now take place because you have the quote unquote boots on the ground, but then you also have your local officials that are aligning and saying, okay, things need to change.
Is the list of the changes published anywhere? Because I've sort of looked around for, I mean, I understand the basic, we have to deal with the police department, but like other community things, like if people just want to look for, you know, these are the exact things that everybody's asking for.
Yes, yes.
Too big.
So it can be. So the question was, is there a list published of demands? So there are a couple of places. One is the African American Civic Engagement Roundtable, right? That's a sub organization under Wisconsin Voices. And so if you Google them, you'll see their list of demands, which also aligns with other community activists. There's another organization of community activists called Community Task Force (MKE), and there's also a line with those demands as well. So those two places, again, the African American Civic Engagement Roundtable, and then also Community Task Force (MKE). Any other questions? Any historical questions around, like, why did we get here, or how did we get here, kind of things? Any of those kind of questions? I'm open to go deep. I'm open to go deep. That's a good question. So the question was, how do we keep the momentum going, seeming as that this time or the season that we're in right now seems so much different than previous ones? How do we keep momentum going? And one thing is vitally important, right? And that's for allies that are non-black, right, to continue to speak up, because for a long time, since the beginnings of slavery, there have been black voices speaking up. But I think what helps to change and continue to push momentum forward is having folks from different communities, right, saying that even in the face of not being quote unquote politically correct, I'm going to speak up and I'm going to take a risk, because even when you look at the protests right now, there have been, for one, these protests that you all have seen, and maybe some of you all have even been part of, they are very diverse, right? Ethnically, generationally, they are very diverse. And I firmly believe that that is one of the reasons why we are seeing so much movement, right? That other local officials and others are seeing that it's not just black people saying this is a problem, but it's everyone, right? Saying that these things are a problem. And although, yes, there is murder that happens, all the time in various communities, the people that are supposed to be protecting you should not be the people that are murdering you, right? Is the big thing right there. So that's one huge one, right? So the continuing to speak out. There's something, and I'll say this because it's part of my wheelhouse as well. There's an initiative that's happening right now. Right now, it's about between 30 to 50 churches from the city and suburbs that are beginning to prepare this day of repentance, right? Where we're coming together and we are giving voice to previous atrocities, but then also how those things and those systems continue to impact people of color in a negative way. And we believe that as these leaders, these church leaders, these community leaders are standing up and saying, like, this was wrong and what's happening right now in these various areas is wrong, that it will continue um, to keep it before other people's eyes, those that are in power, keeping it before their eyes so that they know that this isn't just going to go away, that this isn't just a fad, something else is going to come up later, and then we'll continue to be able to kill black people and people won't care, kind of thing, right? So that's a main one, that we continue to speak out in whatever forms, whatever areas that we have influence in, that we're speaking up. Yes.
Do you have any tips on being white allies? Because I have to imagine that talking to a room full of white people who don't want to do this research themselves gets old after a while. And I'm sure there's a good way to be respectful and to take on spreading this knowledge in a respectful way. But I was curious if you had anything.
Yeah, definitely. Well, being a white ally is something. So the question was, any pointers or tips on how to be a white ally, right? Because spaces like this may get, tiresome for, a black person. Now, I'll first say that yes, it can get tiresome for sure, but at the same time too, my heart is for people of different background to unite, right? So, and I do understand that there are people, from white backgrounds and other backgrounds that, their level of understanding of history and the situations that we're in right now, is very, spread out and diverse as well. So one of the things, in addition to speaking up in your places of influence, is getting some good books to read, right? And I'll give you all a few of them. So I hadn't had the questions yet. I was kind of waiting for some of the questions so I can give some of these books, but I'll talk about a couple of them, right? So when we consider the urban areas in not only Milwaukee and in Wisconsin in general, but across our country, a lot of the what people call ghettos, they did not happen by accident, right? There were tons of systems and years of policy that was put in place to create those, right? So I'm going to answer your question, but I want to kind of set up this particular book that I'm going to mention, right? So when we think about how ghettos were set, right? After slaves were released and set free, 1865, the 13th Amendment, with the 13th Amendment, that basically said that slavery was outlawed unless you were a criminal, right? And that second piece is very important. After it was outlawed, we found in certain things that are called black codes that came up, and also vagrancy laws, right? So what do you do when you have millions of people that you have just released out of an economic system? Because that's what it was. Slavery was instituted in the United States in order to build wealth, right? Bottom line, it was to build wealth. And so now that you have released all of your free labor, how do you continue to keep your businesses up, right? So these things called vagrancy laws were put in place, where if you were found to be homeless or without a job, and obviously if you just came out of slavery, you probably didn't have a job, right? You could be then arrested, and then you could be forced back into labor, right? Because of the law and because of the 13th Amendment that said that slavery was illegal unless you were a criminal, right? So then you have that long swaths of those kinds of things happening in our country. Then you have sharecropping, which is you have black people that are farming the plantation owners' land, but in many cases and situations, they were not getting paid for that, right? They were given maybe food and shelter, but the mass amount of wealth was still being generated on these plantations. That mass amount of wealth was still going to the white community, and again, building wealth more. So come out of sharecropping era, and I'll speed it up. Then you go into, the Jim Crow era, right? So you have Jim Crow, where there again are laws that are segregating black people from white people, right? And during this time in Jim Crow history, we know that there were thousands of African Americans that were not only lynched, but houses burned and just all kinds of manner of horrific things that were done. So coming out of the segregated South was something that was very important for African Americans, as you can imagine. And what began to happen was something that was called the Great Migration. And the Great Migration, which generally happened between the 1930s to about 1970. And this is where, which is recorded, the largest mass exodus of a single people group in the history of the United States, where you have over 6 million people that moved from the segregated South to flee terror, and then they're coming up north. Well, you're coming up north, and even some of the black codes, in the South, basically said that you couldn't read, you were encouraged not to, and I say that lightly, but it was really more serious than that, not to get educated. So now you have all of these African Americans that are coming up north looking for a better life. And so they're looking for a better life, but now they're commingling with other families and other immigrants from European nations that had already been there. And then, then that's a recipe for trouble, because you're saying all of these black people are coming up north. They want to take our jobs, right? So there's historically, you could do a study on it between the 1930s, 1940s, just about every 20 or so days, a black person's home was burned up, right? And especially in the north, right? It was just something that was happening just very consistently. Something that happened, and we just celebrated the 100-year anniversary of it, was what was called Black Wall Street, which happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma, right? Where you have hundreds of African Americans that were killed, very prominent and very affluent society of African Americans, and that was destroyed. Well, that happened a lot in the North too, right? So when you have that, then there was something that happened after that, where whites began to move out of the urban centers, right? Some call that white flight, right? So you move from the urban centers, and then now you have this grouping of African Americans left in urban environments. Many times then the businesses also moved from inner city out to the suburbs, right? That happened. And then as it relates to home ownership, something called redlining began to happen, right? Where it was put in place and put in law, where there were basically areas of maps drawn and said, okay, here's a red area. If this, in this red area, if you are part of the banking system or you sell insurance, any of these red areas, you basically should not touch because they are too risky, right? So you have then African Americans in those areas that it's very hard for them to own a home, right? And you have what was called, and I'm almost done to your book point. Then you also have what's called racially restrictive covenants. Just by showing of hands, is anybody familiar with racially restrictive covenants? So here's what racially restrictive covenants were. And if you just Google racially restrictive covenants and southeastern Wisconsin, you will see that I believe there's 12 to 14 of the surrounding suburbs of Milwaukee documented. It says that if you are not white, you cannot own a home in our suburb. So you're talking about Wauwatosa, you're talking about Shorewood, you're talking about Greenville, New Berlin, you're talking all of the surrounding suburbs. So what happened was you have then this grouping of people that was landlocked, right? It was very difficult for them to be able to get to the jobs that were paying more money to support their families. But now you have it where they cannot own a home in suburban areas. And even the real estate agents, if they were to sell a home to an African American, they could have lost their license. And this happened up until about the 1960s or so. And I know you're saying, okay, 1960s, but if you look at the maps now compared to the redlining maps, they're almost identical, right? So it takes generations to kind of break through that whole kind of legal pinch that was placed on our area. So you have that happening, and so you have these ghettos that are created because, again, individuals are landlocked. They can't own a home anywhere else. And do we know what the most common way that Americans create wealth? Home ownership, right? And so it's then a generational poverty that's put in place. If you cannot own your home, you're a renter, and it's so many barriers in order to be able to own your home. What happens then, generation after generation, it's very difficult for you to break out of that, right? Some people give up. I mean, all of us are, have different levels and different ceilings of, our tenacity, right? And some people just give up, right? And so you see these systems then that are in place, and it creates environments that are powder kegs in many situations, where it's like, okay, I'm tired of living like this, right? What must I do? So that was a very quick, high level kind of explanation. But one of the books that I would recommend for white allies that would give a historical context on a lot of that, and especially like the Great Migration and how people move north and real stories, is a book that's called Warmth of Other Suns. Warmth of Other Suns. And it basically chronicles several African American families over multiple generations from post slavery moving to the north, right? Another is The Color of Law, that looks at redlining and looks at some of the systemic injustices that have been set up in our country. Yeah. So white allies, speaking up, especially in those areas and places of influence. If something is off, if something is unjust, speaking up about it. Two is doing the research and reading. And again, those are just two books out of a ton that I can recommend. Other questions? Please.
I mean, as a pastor, like we talked to a lot of our staff, and some of them filled out a questionnaire. Some of it, I think whenever we do our insurance thing, I'm like the oldest one in our group. So, yep. But there's a lot of young people, and they talked about just stresses and anxiety. I mean, and with everyone in your congregation and being a leader, I mean, part of it is like how. You must have advice for your congregation. How do you give advice to these young people that are just like, they believe in the movement, but they're feeling stress of COVID, stress of not having a job, being unemployed for a while, protests, and like, what can you do? And am I doing enough or not enough? I think there's a lot of stress for a lot of people.
Yeah, definitely. So with the amount of stress was the question is, what can we do to help relieve, some of that stress. Um, One of the things that I share with our congregation, so there's spiritual context. There's also natural context that's informed by the spiritual, and one is to pace what you're doing, right? Because social media, and for a lot of us here, I'm sure can agree that because you're getting inundated by so much, right, that it's important for us to unplug, right, to be able to stay in the fight long term. I have to do the same thing, right? And that's wisdom for me. It's wisdom that I give to others, that pick a battle as well, because there are many to fight, but we don't want to be a jack of all trades and a master of none, right? So pick your battle, determine what it is, and we're actually a series that we're in right now. We're talking about the different giftings and that kind of thing, and being able to stay in your lane. That was last week's message, as a matter of fact. It's important to figure out, determine what is your lane, right? Maybe your lane is protesting for some, right? So stay in that lane. Maybe your lane is advocating for civic change, right? Maybe you have friends or you have networks where you have influence, right? So stay in that lane, right? Maybe for others of us, we have a network of friends that we know could be more educated about what's taking place, right? So stay in that lane, right? Do your study, do your research, so then that you can help those friends and those family members, right? But it's important to, again, pick a lane, stay in it. The first one that I mentioned is so important too. Is pace this thing out, right? This is a lifestyle, right? It's not a, okay, give me the silver bullet, the quick fix, so that I can fix this and then go back to my normal life. I think all of us will agree that once COVID hit, all of our lives were no longer normal, right? And even with, which I personally believe that being in this pandemic, it's one of the positive things out of so many horrific and tragic things is it's helped us to take stock of what really matters in life, right? It's helped us to really sit down and have the time to think about all of these other things over here that I cared so much about a few months ago. Those things really aren't the main things anymore. And they never really should have been, right? But with now the pandemic happening, and then we're seeing just this onslaught of so many different lives being lost, and just injustices and things of that nature, it's important for us to know that this is a lifelong thing. And if you try to jump all in at 110% and spread yourself thin across so many different areas, you're going to burn out. And we know that the symptoms of burnout is often anger, lashing out at people, uh, unhealthy coping mechanisms, from drug addiction to all different kinds of things. So it's important. Pick your battle, and then space things out.
Yeah, I like that. That would go.
It's true. It's very true. Yeah, I can't tell you the number of people just recently that are close to me that said, you know what, I'm going to take a break from social media for a little while. I just need to kind of collect myself, and it's healthy to do. Yeah.
So this is a touchy topic, but whenever people say Black Lives Matter, it's important to touch on how queer and trans lives matter as well. Could you maybe talk about historically why those things are intricately linked?
Okay. So the question was Black Lives Matter and why it's important to talk about trans lives, and you said and queer as well too, right? So a couple of things with the Black Lives Matter conversation, right? I think it's also important to talk through. One is sometimes when you say Black Lives Matter, people, in the white community, they shut down, right? Now, many times it's because of the organization, right? Which, from my understanding, those from the LGBTQ community actually helped to start the Black Lives Matter movement. And that would be one of the linkages there. But it's also important to understand that everybody that is saying Black Lives Matter isn't necessarily associated with the organization Black Lives Matter, right? It's a statement like, I don't know, to give an example, I say, I like cold water because I have cold water sitting here, right? And then someone brands that, creates an organization around it called I Like Cold Water. Well, just because I say I like cold water, it doesn't necessarily mean that I agree with everything the organization I Like Cold Water is talking about, right? And many times the fuel and the momentum and the push to see change can be watered down if those in the white community don't understand or are not informed that everyone that is saying Black Lives Matter isn't necessarily associated with the organization. They just believe at a base human level that Black lives, they matter because in the face of so many injustices that are taking place, it's evident that they don't really matter that much to some, right? And so that, again, kind of touched on the intrinsic connection between Black Lives Matter, the queer and LGBTQA community, and also the understanding that if I'm saying Black Lives Matter, I'm saying, and especially being a Black man, I said Black Lives Matter before there was an organization called Black Lives Matter, because I have experienced countless situations with racism in my life, right? Undeniable. So, yeah. Yeah. Other questions? Other questions? Let's talk on some touchy ones. Let's hear some ones that maybe people that have said, maybe that you don't necessarily believe, but for the sake of this forum and having someone from the African American community that can speak to it, maybe let's give that opportunity. What are some things, some questions that you have heard? Mm-hmm. Okay.
There's a lot of people that I think do believe in Black Lives Matter cause, but then there's people that maybe they're not way over to supporting police officers entirely.
Mhm.
But I hear a lot of, well, my brother's a police officer, and well, just speaking to that, like, what do you think some of these officers that are individuals
Mhm.
might be thinking? Because most of them probably didn't get their job to do the hateful thing that happened to George Floyd. But I think there's just a lot there that anything we have to say about that.
Yeah, definitely. So the question around, Black Lives Matter, but then you also have either family in the police force, or you're supporting police officers, and kind of the sticky, oftentimes awkward dichotomy between, okay, if I support Black lives, then that means that I automatically don't support police officers, right? And I think I don't think I know, it's important for us to know that we are complex people, right? You can support two things at the very same time, and it be okay. Right? So often, and I hear the same thing, that sometimes there's this thought that, okay, if you support Black lives, then you hate police officers. Well, and I had a talk with someone just it's about a month ago about this. Like, I have friends that are police officers, right? I have friends, close friends, that are on the force, right? But I still support Black lives, and there are people on the force that support Black lives as well, right? So for those of us that have influence, and in our groups and in our networks of friends or family, where you might hear that it's either or, it's important for you to inform them. Again, that goes back to the white ally and what that means to be a white ally. That you can love both, and it's important for you. It's really important for you to love both, right? Yeah.
Do you have a very concise, clean way to explain defund the police to anybody that asks about it?
Sure. Good question. So, question was, do I have a clean way to explain defund the police and what that means, right? So, first, there is, in some of the local organizations, one of the demands is to defund the police, right? Basically, here's what it means. I personally now, from here's what Brian says. I think semantically, word choice, you probably could have used a different word there, right? But it is what it is. Now everybody's saying defund the police. What does it mean, right? It simply means this: that the amount of resources, the amount of dollars that have gone to supporting police forces, many communities believe that they can prove that those resources or funds could be better spent in other organizations that help to meet community needs, right? That police officers aren't even trained to handle, right? When you consider the amount of people that are maybe killed or harmed that have a mental illness, right? Police officers aren't necessarily trained to deal with mental health and the mental health community. So if I've been trained that if someone is coming at me to harm them or to shoot or to protect my life in any way possible, then that's what's going to happen. But instead, if you have, and I know this isn't concise, I'll get to the concise part. Instead, there are from social workers or mental health professionals that we can instead put more funds to that community, so that if we get a call that, okay, someone is attempting to harm themselves or harm someone else, and we know or believe that this person has a mental health challenge or history, then we call the people that are professionally able to deal with that, to de-escalate the situation, and not the police force, because it could end up badly, right? And so, in a nutshell, defunding the police means a reallocation of resources to organizations that can better handle situations that police officers aren't trained to deal with, right? And when you think defund, oftentimes you think that means totally disband. Now there are some places that are looking at that. Some have such of a sordid history with their local police force that they're saying, like, the system is so corrupt that we have to think about what are we going to do differently. But for personally, what I know about the demands here locally, defund the police means to reallocate resources. Good questions. Good questions. Sure.
I mean, I know it's great that this is happening with the folks on police brutality and talking about defunding police, but is there also a place to talk about bigger issues that like injustice in the U.S., like how much the military, how much budget is spent on the military, how much education is spent funded. Like, is there also room in the conversation to also talk about those things? Because I feel like there's such momentum happening. It's not like you can fix every problem, but I don't want to take
Prisons.
yeah, prison reform, like all that stuff. You know, the whole credit system and how like, corrupt that is. It's just I don't know. I just feel like all these things are all kind of intertwined.
They are.
Nobody wants to take the focus off of police brutality, but the whole system's kind of corrupt. How do we address that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question was around how do we address even wider issues or challenges that are linked or even connected with also police and prison system, healthcare, education. And there are at this moment, and I get you, like while the wave is moving, if you're a surfer, you want to catch, you want to catch that wave and ride it. And right now, at least I'm getting the sense that the police brutality piece is one that because it was the tipping point or the straw that broke the camel's back, that's the one that people are really focusing as much attention as possible. Because if you then can begin to make changes there, then that begins to open the wider conversations for, healthcare and housing and education and those kinds of things, because it will be then a domino effect. To give you an example of how that's already happening or starting to happen, at least, there are many that believe for Milwaukee Public Schools that the presence of the Milwaukee police force in a lot of the schools was something that not only sent the wrong message, but it also helped to push Black students towards this school to prison pipeline, right? And because police brutality was dealt with first, or is being dealt with first, that has then opened up the conversation to defund in that area, to defund the Milwaukee Police Department being in Milwaukee Public Schools. And so you can kind of see at least one of those dominoes there is having that trickle down effect, which, hopefully, and it's only been like a month, just a little over a month, but we're hoping to see more of that kind of thing begin to happen, where we can have some truly critical conversations around the other systems that need to change too. But yeah, I'm still open to talk through and answer more questions too. It's something as kind of a high level thing that I share with Jack as well. Being that I'm an intercultural, or some people call it a cross cultural competence professional, there is something that I do where there's an assessment called the IDI that looks at where are people on this continuum of being able to interact and build healthy relationships with people from different backgrounds. And then after understanding where you are on that continuum, then developing a personal plan so that you can continue to grow, so that you will be better able to have healthy relationships, healthy communication with people from different backgrounds. So that's something that Jack and I, we in general mentioned, but I just want to put that out there that if there's ever any kind of thought or interest in something like that, I use that to help companies begin to develop their diversity and inclusion strategy and that kind of thing too. Awesome, great question. And it's funny that you mentioned that. I just spoke before the Franklin, Wisconsin School Board, talking about the same thing. I was part of a student-led and alum-led protest for Franklin students, and they asked me to speak and kind of talk through curriculum change, because that's something that right now they're saying the same thing. Like, look, we need real American history that really covers African American history, right? So I shared some thoughts and some resources as well. And that's something that, yes, I do have an opinion on, and can guide to some resources too.
Take your information and I forward it on to like people that are actually like doing the groundwork. That would be amazing.
Awesome. Awesome. Would love to. Would love to. Oh yeah, definitely. Any other questions?
20 minutes that I missed. But something that I've noticed a lot working in the service industry is sometimes we have customers who feel comfortable to make microaggressions around us instead of having to
Mhm.
But I'm wondering how you suggest like
Yeah, good question. Well, that's something definitely that would be part of a comprehensive plan, because I don't want to recommend something and it not be, top down, but think with some discussion had, let's say for instance, there's certain policy in place, right? Depending upon what the microaggression is, that again, with support from leaders, be able to mention, hey, when you said this, here's what it sounded like you were saying. I'm not sure if you meant to say that or not, but that's really not cool, right? So again, that's using your influence to be able to educate, even in a short, very brief way, be able to educate those that are a part of the environment that you frequent. Yeah. But again, in a larger fashion, that might look like, here's an FAQ list, right? Of when someone says something like this, here are some company responses that we have that will help to educate, as well as kind of help the situation not be so awkward. Mm-hmm.
Question is more directed towards the management, but I do know from my other friends in customer service and friends that work in a company that just like we're feeling extremely sensitive. We can be like easily inflamed. Everyone's stressed out right now. This is different than before the pandemic, when it's just a difficult guest. Is there when it conflicts with your morals, is there besides like getting your manager, is there like something that you are recommending that we do when we feel uncomfortable dealing with a guest? Because it is extremely stressful right now, and I'm seeing my friends feel very ragged from the experiences that they're having every day, because I think as Kyle put it, like everyone seems to be on the best or the worst behavior at this time, and I'm sure it's just because it's a difficult time. But
Are you talking about customers?
yeah.
I mean, maybe Jack is speaking a little bit, but like specific, can you be like one specific? I mean, is it like sexual harassment?
No,
Is
just
it-
like I'm seeing guests come in and go, be talking at my bar. This was before COVID. This was before everything. Going hashtag I can't breathe and things like that. Where I'm just like, I don't even want to talk to
saying that?
Yeah, I don't even want to talk to this guest. But
Yeah.
and yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're just open underwear now. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Something that probably talk about today. I know some of you, we've opened up that you can always talk to like HR, so he's in Texas right now, he's working remote, helps out a little bit.
Mhm.
So what we have, I mean, I don't know. This is definitely something that we can talk about together to say, somebody's coming in. I mean, I hear what you're saying, because there's always customers that come in and wrap people, especially just at a couple cocktails. And, but I mean, we can tolerate racism, sexism, but things like about a mask, but it's still harassing you guys. So, I mean, I think maybe we have to talk about some of the smaller things and how we can get behind you guys.
And I know we shouldn't respond emotionally, but at the same time, it's like everything is so touchy right now. I mean, masks come down to like feeling like your safety is being attacked. I mean, I've heard staff years back do the making fun of I can't breathe, things like that. And even when it's like that, I'm just like I don't know how to maintain professionality, and this is so enraging to me, and it feels like it's attacking my morals, and I don't quite know how to. Because you don't also want to be causing drama at your work either, or your bosses do it. So
I mean, as far as these things to do with masks and maybe some of the COVID stuff that's not, maybe it's not racially or sexually charged, but it's still bugging you guys. I mean, I will say, as far as like someone saying something about race, sexuality, gender, we don't tolerate that, period. And there's been a lot of stuff on social media where a person might call out, you know, there was so and so, I saw this bartender at comment say this about a person. And, you know, we right now, you know, we might have hundreds of people that work for us. And since Scott and I were workers in 1993, probably thousands and thousands of people that I can't control their mouth. But unless you guys tell us that something has happened or go to your GM, if you don't feel comfortable going to your GM, you go up the next scale to one of us. If we don't know, we can't do anything. And when we find those things out, I guarantee you they get investigated. We don't just sit back on butts and be like, this person was harassed. Someone said some crazy horrible thing.
Maybe that was a new category.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's something that's not, maybe it's not your biggest moral core issue, but you're still like, I gotta wait on this person. So we will talk about that.
Yeah.
I appreciate bringing it up.
Yeah, and this is just, you know, ideas, you know, throwing out there too. Again, with, as you said, maybe having a new category and having, here are some common responses that can be made that really address that, because that's empowering then to the wait staff to know that, okay, if someone is saying this, then, or this particular thing or that particular thing, and especially if it's happened consistently, like, and it's affecting or eroding their mental health because it's, you know, attacking their moral core. Here are some things that my company is getting behind me and being able to say. I think that would be important. Yeah. Because even if it's, you know, similar to the survey, where it's like, here are some of those common microaggressions, here are some of those common statements, and then being able to look at those and craft some responses.
What would people?
Yeah. Well. Yeah.
Is there any historical information, present day information that are Alex?
Yeah. So definitely there's a list of books that I could give, but as allies, again, I think the warmth of other suns would definitely help, because right now it's important for there to be just a contextualization of, like, how did we get here, right? Which is huge, because what I find in many of my conversations with you know, those from white communities, is that there's not an understanding of actually how we got here, right? And with having that, then you'll be able to say, okay, this thing didn't just pop up in 2020, but there's a long history of that. And then also some of the systemic injustices and how they're baked in to many of the institutions that, that we frequent,
I think you posted the podcast as well, your police that to they weren't called police, but they were policing the slave.
Yeah, like militias,
And I can't
slave
remember
catchers.
the name of the escape, but you probably got some basic football.
Mhm.
History. Remember his name?
It was on Throughline. It was the office. It wasn't about a specific book. I mean, I think there's a bibliography.
Maybe it's a writer as well.
Yeah.
Person there, yeah.
Yep.
But yeah, so much learned because they're not teaching it in the schools. Like
Right.
Split, but
Yeah, very true. Very true. We're in just in general to that day of repentance that I mentioned. In September, we are taking suburban, predominantly white churches, as well as city, predominantly African American, Latino, taking them through a 4 to 5 week history course, if you will. And that's something that I've put together a curriculum for. But it's a combination of not only various films and documentaries, but excerpts from various books, and then kind of contextualizing with southeastern Wisconsin, talking about how we got so segregated and all of the pain that's caused in the various communities too. So we'll be doing that in September. I know it's more of a religious context, but if there's interest, it could easily be adopted to a non-religious context too. So.
I have a question too, and I will share this video with our staff that wasn't here, but maybe even other restaurants. But years ago, I was going to this employee walking meetings, they were talking about the city. And one of the things they were saying, they kept saying to the restaurant owners, what do you guys need? Like, what sort of jobs do you have? And me and a couple other people are like, we should be talking about what we can do in the community. And one thing that I think all of, I have many friends in the restaurant community. I know we want more diverse staffs. Like you comment, for instance, Scott, I've owned since 95. If you're a kid and you grew up around there and you go get coffee there, you probably feel pretty comfortable applying for a job when you're 17, 18. You probably start as a dishwasher or whatever. But when these restaurants decide to must be living in the community, really nothing. It's hard to try staff. I mean,
I don't think I've ever had an application from a white guy.
I mean, we reached out to Milwaukee and things like that, and community, but to really, I think we could all use tips on how to build.
Definitely.
Entire city.
Definitely, yeah. And so I'm working with another company to talk through some of those same challenges too, at a high level. But it'll definitely take a deeper conversation. But at a high level, it still starts with that education piece, right? But then also there needs to be communication to the community at large that I am a safe place to work in, right? Because I have an IT and cybersecurity background as well, and several of the places that I have worked, my coworkers did not have a good understanding of the African American community, and then that brought harm, that brought frustration, that brought an unhealthy work environment, right? So I felt okay with, this next place is. I was just waiting for the motorcycle. That was louder. I was okay with, this next place, because I'm agreed to go to this next place that's paying me more, because I don't really have a feeling of community here. because my coworkers don't, in many cases, don't value what I bring to the table, right? So communities have to know, and this again is speaking from the African American community, they have to know that you're a safe place to work in, right? So there's going to have to be some of that upfront communication, whether that be in various areas of marketing, whether that be in roundtable discussions, whether that be, town hall kind of meetings or whatever with communities, so that people can feel safe with not only I could come here and make a decent living, but I could come here and actually feel like these folks are a community that I can really vibe with. Because if that's not there, and if they're not sure, they'll never tell you. They just won't come, right? Yeah. But yeah, definitely open to more discussions on that. Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about supporting Black businesses and working with Black businesses, maybe just like for everybody here on a company level as well, but also touch on gentrification?
Okay. So supporting Black businesses, of course, I say yes, right? Not only because I'm African American, but there's a long history with African American businesses, even in this area. Like when you talk about, even a little further from here, Bronzeville and different areas that have been destroyed, that have had Black thriving businesses and Black communities that are thriving, and seeing those torn up for whatever reasons. I support it. There's an app. The name is escaping me at the moment, but there's an app for supporting Black businesses where you can pull it up and see all of the various businesses in different kind of different modalities. So yes, I'll figure out what the name is, and I could, I guess, send the app name. And what was the other question?
How can you explain gentrification?
Yeah. So gentrification in I'll try to explain it shortly, in kind of a very condensed way. But it's basically there are various motives behind going into poor areas and pouring resources into those areas, and then putting businesses that may not necessarily look like the communities in those areas, right? I understand there's different reasons behind that. But in effect, what happens is in gentrification is that typically white Americans will go into an area, put businesses there, property values go up, other businesses are saying, oh, that's a neat place to have a business too. I'm going to do something there, or I'll start new housing developments there that are more expensive, and the poor community or the community in poverty there cannot afford those areas. So they end up having to find a new place to live, right? So that, as it may have started off as, it's a good place to maybe pour some resources or funds into a community, it also can have an adverse effect in the that displacing people.
Is there a way to balance that? Would you want to help it's not what person's job to help this community, but is there a good way to balance that?
Yeah. So and again, this is Brian in a short conversation and answer, but let me ask this. Balance that. What entity are you? Are you the business, or are you, from what angle are you coming from?
Both, as a customer or a business.
Yeah. Okay. So from a business perspective, what that can also look like is partnering with businesses or organizations that are already in the community, right? So whether that be community centers, right? Your local Boys and Girls Club, or your local pet food pantry, or your local even churches, or whatever organizations that are doing positive work in the community already. it's important for that new business coming in to have a relationship, right? To build those relationships, right? Because again, that's going to build trust, number one, but then two, that's also going to help, going back to some of the previous questions, that's also going to help to diversify your workforce, because they're going to already have that trust baked in, right? Yeah. So from a customer perspective, I'm not as sure as how to help balance things out. Yeah. But definitely from a business perspective, that would be one.
I found that app. I mean, I follow them on Instagram. On Instagram, it's got Katie Black Official.
Uh-huh.
But then they said their app is called Katie Black. So you must have to go there and download it.
To download that. Okay, great. Yeah, but that's one for Black-owned businesses.
Should we wrap it up? Unless anyone else has anything. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely welcome. Welcome. You all online are welcome as well.
Bye, everyone. Hey, thank you everyone for hanging out with us this afternoon. I think if there's any sort of feedback, I think I'll probably put out another survey for people to get feedback. Anything to follow up on, if contact information of Brian's or follow-up questions, please reach out to me directly. You can text me, call me, 920-242-4426. Thanks, everyone.